This is Chapter 9, Part 2. Let's continue talking about some of the details of ASD. ASD is 4 times as common as boys compared to girls. So there's definitely a large sex difference there, that boys are have much higher risk of developing ASD. And one of the reasons for this, researchers think, is that there could be sex hormones involved that might influence the development of this disorder. It is mostly, as we'll see here in a moment, it's mostly a genetically influenced disease. But other factors do matter, evidently matter, like sex hormones. Researchers have theorized that ASD is an extreme, quote-unquote, masculine brain, which systematizes, while a strong feminine brain is good at empathizing. So one of the explanations they give for why you see this at much higher rates among boys versus girls is this idea that a major gender difference between males and females is that males tend to have a thinking style of, systematizing, meaning that you like to, you will come up with various, if you develop a theory with various concepts and you're trying to make sense out of something in some holistic, big picture way, that's systematizing, where you're trying to kind of make sense out of it in a systematic way and organize all of these concepts into one whole, or that kind of thing. So the types of jobs that might be where someone would need to be good at systematizing, say if you were an engineer who was going to help work with other engineers to design a car, you've got to be able to, there's a lot of working parts that all have to work together smoothly in a harmonized fashion if you're going to get a car that functions. So someone who's a good engineer, someone who's a good car designer, would be a good systematizer, because they can think in terms of systems, which is, a car is a very complex system. On the other hand, this feminine brain is the thinking here is that females tend to be much better than males at empathizing, and that's something that's probably more familiar to you than the systematizing idea, which is that you're able, by empathizing, you're able to put yourselves in the shoes of other people, to understand where other people are coming from, to be able to feel like others feel, and be able to think like others think. So that's an empathizing ability, which research does show that females tend to be much better at this than males. Of course, we're talking here about statistical differences. There's plenty of exceptions to that tendency. Same thing with systematizing. But the idea is that someone who's got ASD they have a hard time understanding other people. They have a hard time putting themselves in the shoes of another person and feeling like another feels, but they may be very good at certain systematizing of kind of analyzing, breaking things down and seeing the parts of things, and so it might be very good with the numbers, for example, certain mathematical skills, things like that. So anyway, that's just some of the thinking you've seen here, trying to explain or understand better the ASD. Sometimes ASD individuals have difficulty speaking and understanding the speech of others. So communication challenges are quite frequently seen with folks who have ASD. And so there's the 2 parts there, being able to speak well, and also being able to understand the speaking of others, and also the nonverbals too, being able to read other people, what their intentions are, being able to predict somebody else's behavior, or tell what's coming from another person next. That these are difficulties that ASD people tend to have. So it's the understanding as well as being able to speak to others. Now, mentioned before about the genetic influence, it's high for ASD, about 0.8. Remember that what that fraction or that decibel means. It varies from 0 up to 1. 1 being a trait that would be 100% influenced by genes and no environmental influence. And really, there's not anything that's 100%. But this 0.8 means that 80% of the explanation of why someone develops ASD and another person doesn't is due to genes, is due to genetic influence. So it's mostly a genetic disorder, with some other, again, of course, always environmental influence as well. And this is a trend that we see with a lot of the different disorders that the author is talking about. We've talked about in previous chapters, talked about schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, some of these things that are correlated with violent behavior, and that all of these tend to have quite high heritability levels. So they tend to run in families, and they tend to run in families because where do you get your genes from? Well, you inherit them from your biological parents. So more than 100 genes have been associated with ASD, have been identified. So in recent decades, we've had more sophisticated studies that examines genes specifically, all 20,000 of them, and is able to pinpoint those that are associated with developing ASD, and they've been able to identify more than 100 now, which is, if you look at different disorders or different health problems, at this point, if they've identified more than 100, then that's really showing the importance of the genetic influence. Now, I've stressed in previous chapters that ASD is not correlated with more violent behavior, and I can't stress that enough in this chapter where the author is talking so much about ASD, and I've followed her lead in talking about ASD a lot. But you need to remember that just by itself, the best research I've seen doesn't show any higher rates of violent behavior among these folks than the general population by itself. But what happens is quite often this disorder happens at the same time as other disorders, that a person will have more than one issue going on, and it's the other issues that may predict more violent behavior. So even though ASD has been linked to some high-profile mass killings, for example, the Sandy Hook killing that we talked about previously, and some other ones too, the general literature finds no significant link between ASD and violence alone. We're just looking at ASD alone. If you're in combination with these other things, then yes, you can see a risk factor there. And we'll talk about the other things that sometimes go along with the ASD. So we see here ASD is linked with violence when it occurs together. Now, this term for when you have multiple disorders or multiple difficulties, multiple diagnoses, they'll call it comorbidities. So they're talking here about comorbidities when ASD is accompanied by something else in a person. And by the other things that the author is stressing in this chapter and in previous chapters, traumatic brain disorder, or I should say injury, which we'll talk about later. Also comorbid, meaning happening at the same time with bipolar disorder, we've talked about some before, and also schizophrenia, which we've also talked about before. Personality disorders also, and childhood trauma, which we'll talk about more in this chapter. So you see these other disorders in a person who also has ASD. And when these things combine like this, then you do see an elevated risk of violent behavior. Now, the author does present some evidence that ASD is overrepresented among mass killers, but the general violence literature suggests it is other comorbidities that create the risk factor. So again, it's really, if you're looking at ASD in isolation, it doesn't seem to predict violence, even though it's kind of been stressed sometimes in the coverage of mass shooters. Again, this is sort of something the media is doing. The media, since ASD has really mushroomed as an epidemic around the country in the past few decades, it's on people's minds a lot. And so there's going to be a tendency to look for it in these killers, and to stress it and magnify it, and to maybe look at it in isolation as opposed to looking at these other comorbidities. So again, this is sort of a media thing that is going on here too. ASD can reduce coping skills for people suffering from other disorders linked to violence. So again, if you've got multiple challenges going on, the more things you have working against you, the bigger challenge that you have. Now, some researchers have suggested a new diagnosis, and they've given this diagnosis the label of criminal autistic psychopathy. For a small group, we're not talking about ASD individuals in general, but for a small group and of individuals in psychopathic traits who have committed crimes. So they've seen a pattern of, again, this is a subgroup. This is not typical. This is not what you most often see with ASD individuals. It's more the exception than the rule. But among this small group, you'll see this sort of triad of ASD and then psychopathy, and we talked about that in the previous chapter, having psychopathic traits, which we know definitely strongly predict violent behavior. And then also, if you've committed crimes, well, then by definition you're someone who's got a tendency, a proneness to commit crimes. So they have developed this new diagnosis, but again, it only applies to a small subtype. We do not want to generalize it and say this is typical of folks with ASD. Now, a specific study that's cited, there's an overlap between those with ASD and mass killers in this particular study. Where they see that certain traits that you can see among both mass killers and a tendency of seeing these things among people with ASD. Number one, extreme focus. We talked about how some of these mass killers are obsessive about the people they're blaming for their problems, maybe obsessive and extreme focus on mass killings in the case of some of these individuals we've covered in this course. So this sort of obsessive, narrow, extreme focus could contribute to the tendency to be involved in mass killings. Number two, the poor ability to understand and interpret others. So if you've got social challenges challenges of not being able to understand people well, misreading, misinterpreting people, and also maybe communications problems on your end, that this is setting up certain challenges, certain part of this pathway we've talked about this semester, this pathway towards violence. So all of these things kind of contributing something and kind of being they're pointing to commonalities here between ASD individuals and mass killers. Number three, lack of empathy or concern for others. So again, sort of this challenges with connecting with other people, challenges with understanding other people, challenges perhaps with empathizing with other people, with challenges with being able to put yourself in the shoes of others, be able to feel what they feel and think what they think. Number four, the tendency to blame others for one's distress. And five, a history of childhood trauma. So in this particular study, they found a tendency for both ASD folks and mass killers to have this in common. Again, we don't want to misinterpret these findings. They're showing some similarities here, but we got to go back to this finding that ASD does not predict violent behavior just by itself. Now, these traits could also be correlated with other things that we know that you sometimes see in these mass killers, or often see in these mass killers: obsessive thinking, conspiratorial thinking, and blaming others, which themes that we've already talked about in this course. Now, you know what? This next point's a big one. I would actually like to take more than just a minute on this next one. So we're about 14 minutes into this one. Let's take a break. We come back in part 3, and I'll open it up with this larger kind of point that I want to make.